I'm Joe Park, CEO of Horizon Stewardship. I'm joined today by Reverend Lisa Greenwood, who's a United Methodist clergy appointed to the Texas Methodist Foundation, where she serves as Vice President of Leadership Ministries with a focus on developing courageous leadership in our churches today. In full disclosure, Lisa and I are married, and we're pleased to get to collaborate with you on this work today. In the next 20 minutes, we're going to explore a topic we call Shaking Up the Sacred, stewardship in a time of disruption. You may think of it as stewardship through courageous leadership in a time of disruption, and here's why. It's never easy to make changes, and yet in this unprecedented season, we're given the opportunity like never before to experiment with new practices. During this webinar and breakout, we're going to look at obstacles to making changes we need to make in our churches and offer several practical ideas for strengthening ministry and increasing generosity. Let's begin by assessing how we're doing as a culture and then move into generosity at the church level. The slides you're about to see are brand new research from Giving USA and reflect giving through the end of 2009. Let's explore first how Americans are doing in regard to generosity. As you can see, total giving continues to climb with almost $450 billion given to charities in 2019. That's an increase of just over 4% from 2018. Now, the gold columns are years in which the U.S. had a recession. Americans continue to increase the amount they give in almost every non-recessionary period. But as you can see, recessions most often resulted in a decline in giving. Considering the impact of recessions on giving is important to us today because the U.S. economy just contracted an annualized rate of 32.9% in the second quarter of this year. That's the worst in history, and the impact of that will surely flow through to charitable giving. Now in this slide, we see individual giving illustrated as a percentage of disposable income, which is defined as income after taxes are paid. You can see that Americans have made little progress becoming more generous over the past 40 years. Even in 2019, when disposable income increased by 4.3%, giving as a percent of disposable income remained a constant 1.9%. There are 2 points I want you to take away from the last two slides. First, the amount of giving to charitable causes in the U.S. continues to grow. The second point is that these increases are not an indication of Americans growing more generous, but rather us becoming more affluent because we continue to give just 1.9% of our disposable income, and that has remained relatively flat for almost 40 years. Now let's shift to looking at giving to religion. The next slide shows a distribution of charitable dollars among recipients in 2019. As you can quickly see, religious organizations received the largest portion of contributions, around 29%. Religion has long since received the greatest share of the charitable pie. However, as we're going to see in a moment, this is changing. Although religion receives the largest share of charitable givings, over the past 2 years, 2017 to 19, in net inflation-adjusted giving, we see a decline of 1.7% in religious giving. This is particularly disturbing because you can see that all other categories except foundations saw an increase in giving. I wish I could share with you that this was a one-time aberration, but sadly it's not. This illustration shows contributions by recipients since 1980 in 5-year increments. You can see that as late as 1989, religion received close to 57% of all charitable giving. That's over half. But since that point, there's been a steady decline, maybe even a free fall, all the way to 29% in 2019. In simple terms, the church is receiving half the percentage of total giving that it was just 30 years ago. And this brings us to our main point today. Lisa and I want to answer the questions: what was working prior to 1990? What has changed? And what can we do about it?
Thanks, Joe. We all know the culture used to push people toward the church. Let's take a closer look at why that was true. Yuval Levin, in his book Fractured Republic, talks about the first half of the 20th century as a time of cohesion. Think about what occurred in the first half of the 20th century. World War I, the Depression, World War II, all driving people toward national unity. Then there's the rise of mass media, mass transportation, big industry, centralized government, all of which reinforced cohesion. The values of the time were consensus and affiliation, conformity, assimilation. Think about what it means to value affiliation and conformity. It was a time when all membership-based organizations from the Rotary Club to bowling leagues thrived. Charles Handy, in his book Beyond Certainty, talks about that period as a time when we lived in a convergent culture. Now, convergence exists when there is general agreement on the issues, the questions of the day, and general agreement around the perceived right answer to those questions. And everyone bends to that answer. A convergent culture values certainty, agreement, alignment, sameness, and tends to have a monochromatic veneer. Even when what's under the veneer looks different, no one talks about it. For basically all membership-based organizations in the U.S., including the church, this whole season was a time of natural, organic growth. Thomas Friedman reminds us, you don't need a plan to grow, you just have to manage the growth. And that's what we did. The mainline church as we know it came of age in this time of conformity and convergence. It grew, and we formed structures and systems to manage the growth. Gil Rendle, in his book Quietly Courageous, points out this time of convergence and growth was an aberrant time in our history, meaning it's not the norm, and we cannot assume it will return. He uses Levin and Handy's work to explain that this aberrant time is ended. If the first half of the 20th century was about consensus, the second half, post-World War II, gave rise to individualism and mistrust of institutions. We also see the rise of a divergent culture. The questions may be the same, but the answers are varied and nuanced. A divergent culture values diversity, uniqueness, individuality. We have peeled back the monochromatic veneer to reveal the richness and complexity of our diverse perspectives, lifestyles, cultures, voices. The aberrant time of convergence is ended, and it means it is no longer a time of growth for membership-based institutions, which of course includes the church. And there is nothing to indicate that we are in a turnaround situation. Think about what this means. The vast majority of people in our churches have been trained to think in convergent, affiliation-minded, even linear ways. Our worship, our buildings, ministry activities, even mission and outreach, as well as our stewardship practices, all formed around a mindset of affiliation and convergence. As membership-based organizations, we were not trained in how to help people change their lives. We were trained in how to help people change their affiliation. Now we have whole generations in the U.S. who have only known a complex, nonlinear, divergent culture. And they make up more than half the population. And they're not just our children. Millennials are approaching 40. They are our neighbors, our doctors, our teachers. They work in our fields and fix our cars. And some are even our pastors. And we don't know how to talk to them or listen to them. And for most of them, the church that we have known and built is completely irrelevant. So here's the kicker. All of this was true 6 months ago before we'd even heard of COVID-19. Think about how much more true it is today. Our world has changed, and there is no going back. There is good news in all of this. It's a time for necessary transformation. This season is what we call an unfrozen time. Organizations become frozen over time as they solidify their practices and norms. And when there is disruption, conditions can unfreeze and change is possible. Now is the time to lean into change, and we get to be part of it. But that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Change, however necessary, brings with it a significant level of anxiety. Edwin Friedman, in A Failure of Nerve, points out that in an anxious system, people behave in predictable ways. When there is free-floating anxiety, people become reactive, they herd together for security, they blame others, and they seek quick fixes. And when their leaders cannot relieve their discomfort, they sabotage their leaders. So as leaders in this anxious season, we have to learn to read the signs of anxiety and remember that these behaviors do not indicate that people are crazy, rather just that they're human. These are normal human responses. As leaders, we can help people see the behaviors and name the underlying anxiety so that they can seek not quick fixes, but deeper understanding and, frankly, new learning. We're not going to lean into this rapidly changing environment by doing what we've always done. We must lean into new ways of thinking and new practices.
Thank you, Lisa. The problem we face today is that the foundation of the stewardship practices that most churches are using were developed for a culture in a church that no longer exists, beyond the builder and silent generations who are in our churches and were born before 1946. One of the legacies of this is that today far too many churches' budgets are still built largely on the giving of donors who have aged into their 70s and beyond. We saw clear evidence in the Giving USA data that these practices are no longer serving the church well. Further complicating these trends are the impact of COVID-19, which has accelerated the pace of changes that were already occurring in our culture. We can see this playing out in that roughly 40% of mainline churches are experiencing a moderate or severe decline in giving during the first half of 2020. The president of the Barna Research Group has suggested that as many as 40% of mainline churches will no longer exist in 5 years. This is primarily due to failed funding models. Now, my message to you today is that a failed funding model need not exist at your church. Even during the COVID crisis, 15 to 20% of churches are thriving, and another 40 to 45% are seeing steady giving. Our experience working with congregations of all sizes and across dozens of denominations has led us to identify 5 disciplines that are foundational to churches who are financially thriving today. In the remainder of our time, I'm going to share these with you. In our experience with churches developing year-round cultures of generosity, we have seen a focus on these disciplines produce an average of 16% increase in year-over-year giving. In this slide, you can see all 5 disciplines illustrated. They are keeping it spiritual, telling your ministry story, building donor relationships, making the ask, and measuring effectiveness. There are a number of best practices which make up the application of each one of these disciplines. You will notice that all of the disciplines flow from vision, which for most churches is simply answering the question, who is my neighbor and what is God calling us to do in response to their needs? The first discipline is keeping it spiritual, which is the most important foundation of any generosity initiative. For keeping it spiritual, best practice applications commonly include preaching and teaching generosity year-round, 1 or more church-wide generosity focuses each year, stewardship and giving being part of your discipleship path, and having a clearly articulated theology of generosity. The next discipline is telling your ministry story. In short, this is effectively communicating how you are transforming lives. Doing so cuts through what the culture has to say about money and replaces it with what God has to say about money. It connects impact to giving, Quite possibly the most effective application of this is weekly offering talks where stories of ministry impact are shared and your church's theology of generosity is explored. Telling stories of impact should permeate all church communication. Be sure to focus on the story of one life that was changed or one life that was transformed because they invested time and money in your church. Be careful not to fall into the trap of replacing a story of a life that was changed with a lot of numbers and statistics. Let the numbers support the story. Next discipline is build donor relations. The church's relationship with its financial supporters is sacred and requires careful cultivation. This obviously begins with a pastor having access to donor records and the courage to engage donors in one-on-one conversations about their giving. Expressing gratitude in a personalized way is absolutely critical to growing a culture of generosity. Build these relationships with your financial leaders before asking anything of them. Ask first about their passions, their motivations, their stories of generosity. Invite them to share their wisdom with you and engage them to help you solve problems. Remember that most financial leaders, especially if they are entrepreneurs, do not enjoy sitting on committees. So find a way to get them involved in hands-on ministry or working to solve a specific issue facing your church. These same practices also work well in developing generosity of time and talents. Next discipline is make the ask. People are most likely to grow in their generosity when they are challenged to take the next step in their spiritual journey. Areas to consider when making specific financial asks are support of your annual ministry budget, special gifts, which are one-time special needs outside what you can fund inside your ministry budget, and of course, capital and planned gifts. Build your ask on the biblical foundation of your theology of generosity that we talked about in keeping it spiritual. And be sure to personalize your ask because everyone's financial situation and spiritual maturity is in a different place. Be clear about what you are asking, what the next step is, and when you will follow up. Always use personal communication when asking. Never send a Dear Member letter. The last discipline is measure effectiveness. This is where you're answering the question in measurable terms, what difference is our investment of human and financial resources making? I showed you the huge transfer of giving that used to go to the church but is now being shifted to other nonprofits. A primary reason for this is that our own best donors do not believe that our ministries are providing the greatest possible return on their financial investment. In response, they're shifting their giving where they believe they'll see the greatest impact. Guilt and desire to support the institution are no longer effective motivators to increasing giving to the church. We must prove that our ministries are the best financial investment our members can make in seeing the world that God desires come about. It is critical that we as leaders ensure our ministries are providing an impactful return on the investments we're making. We must also closely measure the effectiveness of our discipleship path. The primary role of the church is to grow disciples who are motivated to bring about transformation in the world. Discipling our members and attenders, which does include worship, is the single largest expense in most of our churches. It is critical that we demonstrate this investment is funding the desired outcome. For those of you joining our breakout session today, in addition to answering your questions, we're going to be introducing resources that will allow you to drill down on the best practices that we've mentioned here today. Thank you for your time.